The flight had begun like any other, smooth, calm, and routine. First-class passengers were sipping their drinks, checking their phones, or leafing through magazines. The hum of the engines blended with the low murmur of conversation. It was just another evening in the sky. But then everything shifted. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. A flight attendant, sharp-eyed and purposeful, made her way down the aisle. Her movements were quick and deliberate. Like a predator on a mission, she stopped abruptly at a first-class row, standing before an elderly man. His hat was slightly askew, his hands resting calmly in his lap. Without hesitation, she addressed him with an unwavering tone. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting to the soft noise of the cabin, "you need to move to economy." Conversations faltered, heads turned, whispers began to rise. The elderly man slowly lifted his gaze. There was no shock, no rush, just a calm patience as he locked eyes with her. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and held out in front of him. Bold, black letters read, "First class." The flight attendant barely glanced at the pass. "There's been a mistake. You're not supposed to be here," she declared, her eyes narrowing. The man's expression remained stoic, unflinching. He didn't argue. He simply let the boarding pass hang in the air, waiting for her to acknowledge her mistake. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers recognized him. The hat, the eyes, the commanding presence. It was none other than Chuck Norris. But the young flight attendant, her confidence unshaken, saw only an old man who didn't fit her rigid world of rules. A businessman in a tailored suit leaned toward his wife, whispering. "You see what's happening?" he said. His wife nodded, eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. Chuck spoke, his voice steady and calm. "Check your list." The attendant stood her ground, arms crossed. "I don't need to check. This is a first-class cabin. You need to leave." The murmur in the cabin grew louder. Passengers were now fully aware of the scene unfolding before them. Some began recording with their phones. The tension in the air was thick. A stewardess, witnessing the exchange, hesitated for a moment, then quickly disappeared toward the front of the plane. Moments later, the flight supervisor arrived, her uniform more polished, her expression stern but calm. She leaned toward Chuck, lowering her voice but maintaining authority. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" Chuck handed it over, his movements slow and deliberate. The flight supervisor scanned it, checked her tablet, then exchanged a glance with the flight attendant. She nodded slightly. "This is his seat." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Some passengers exchanged surprised glances. Others smirked. The young flight attendant, however, was not finished. She straightened up, taking a step back, her posture rigid. "He's causing a disruption," she insisted. The phrase, "causing a disruption," seemed to linger in the air like a challenge. Something flickered across Chuck's face. Something sharp, just for an instant. From across the aisle, a woman in a navy blue pantsuit exhaled loudly, muttering, "Unbelievable." A man in his 50s leaned forward, his voice rising. "Ma'am, you're the one making a scene." The young flight attendant ignored them, speaking louder now, her voice tinged with defensiveness. "I'm going to escalate this," she said, tapping her earpiece as if to reinforce her authority. The businessman whispered to his wife again, his voice laced with concern. "She's doubling down. Bad move." The tension in the cabin reached a boiling point. The phones were now out in full force. People weren't just watching, they were documenting every second. The flight supervisor took a deep breath, sensing the situation had escalated beyond her control. "Miss," she said quietly to the young flight attendant, "step over here for a moment." Miss Carter, however, shook her head, speaking louder now. "He refuses to move. He's being aggressive." At the mention of aggressive, the cabin went deathly quiet. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. The woman in the navy pantsuit stood, her voice rising. "No, he's not. I've been watching the whole time." A voice from a few rows back chimed in. "You're the problem, lady." The businessman now had his phone out, recording, his screen glowing. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone flat. Miss Carter's face tightened. She hesitated for just a moment, but the room had already spoken. The young flight attendant stood there, her hands now firmly planted on her hips. It was clear she was losing control of the situation. The flight supervisor returned, her eyes scanning the now charged cabin. She didn't need to check her earpiece for an update. She could feel the tension. First class had completely shifted. Passengers were no longer passive observers. They were participants in the unfolding drama. Some still held their phones out, recording. Others murmured amongst themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. A few even cast looks of contempt at Miss Carter, whose confidence had begun to crack. Miss Carter, the supervisor said, her tone even, "We've reviewed the manifest. Mr. Norris is in his assigned seat. There is no issue here." But Miss Carter was far too invested now. Her jaw tightened. "He's making me uncomfortable. And if I feel uncomfortable, I have the right to escalate." A low laugh rippled through the cabin. Someone a few rows back actually chuckled. "You got to be kidding me," the businessman muttered, his tone incredulous. The woman in navy leaned forward, her voice sharp. "So now we're calling discomfort a safety issue?" Miss Carter ignored them. She reached for her radio. "I'm notifying ground security," she declared. Wrong move. The businessman turned fully in his seat, his phone still in hand, recording. "You know you're being filmed, right?" he said. "This is already online." Miss Carter hesitated for just a moment. The flight supervisor stepped in, her voice low and commanding. "Miss Carter, I need a word. Now. I have the right to. Now." Miss Carter bit her lip and clamped her mouth shut. She glanced at Chuck, still hoping someone would come to her defense. But it was clear now. The room had spoken. With a stiff posture, she turned and followed the supervisor down the aisle, her steps heavy. The tension didn't dissipate. It lingered, crackling the air like static electricity. Passengers exchanged glances, wordless agreements passing between them. A few phones still recorded, waiting for what would happen next. Chuck, however, hadn't moved. He remained seated, his hat tipped forward, observing the unfolding chaos with a quiet, steady gaze. A man a few rows back turned to his wife, a bemused expression on his face. "This is going to be everywhere by the time we land." She nodded, her eyes focused on her phone screen. "It already is." The first clip had hit Twitter 5 minutes ago, a short 30-second video showing Miss Carter confronting Chuck Norris. No context, just her demanding he move, his quiet resistance, and the murmurs of disbelief in the background. Retweets were climbing by the second. A chime from the overhead speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice was calm, measured, and anyone who flew often knew what that meant. Something had changed. The flight supervisor returned. Her posture was straighter now, more formal. She cleared her throat, then turned to Chuck with sincere look in her eyes. "Mr. Norris, on behalf of the airline, we sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. Please enjoy the rest of your flight." With that, the flight was once again calm, as the passengers resumed their routines. But one thing was certain. The incident would be remembered long after the plane landed.